Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us for today's event, Belarus on Edge. We're really excited to have a terrific array of panelists, well qualified to discuss this important and sometimes troubling series of developments that we're seeing in Belarus and in the broader sort of post-Soviet region. I'm Ed Schatz. I'm the acting director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto. And we have a terrific, as I mentioned, a series of panelists. This is our first event. We've had a bit of a summer/pandemic hiatus. We expect to be doing a whole series of additional events going forward into the academic year. Again, wanted to welcome you on behalf of CERES to today's event. Today's discussion is part of a new initiative at CERES in the Munk School called the Eurasia Initiative, in which we'll be taking stock of emerging developments across the vast post-Soviet space and perhaps beyond. We've got upcoming events that I hope you'll consider attending. The ambassador of Uzbekistan to Canada and the United States will be talking with us on September 18th. Sarah Cameron, a historian, terrific historian from the University of Maryland, will be talking to us on October the 2nd. We've got 5 or 6 other events, potential events in the pipeline. So I expect that the Eurasia Initiative is going to be a fairly vibrant affair going forward. We have probably about an hour, a little bit more, to discuss a whole series of things. So let's just sort of launch to it. What I'd like to do is introduce Professor Seva Gunitsky, who is an expert on broadly speaking, international relations of post-Soviet space and beyond. And Seva will do the honors of introducing our panelists and moderating our discussion. Before I turn it over to Seva, I will say that there is a Q&A function in Zoom, and that's how we will be receiving questions that eventually we'll have a chance to tackle during the discussion period in the latter half of our event today. So over to Professor Gunitsky.
Well, thank you, Ed, and thanks everybody for joining. We have 3 great speakers here today. It's probably one of the few panels on Belarus where all of the participants have actually been to Belarus, I believe. So instead of me talking, let me just introduce them and see what they have to say. First, we have Lucan, who's a professor of political science here at the Munk School and author of many books and articles on autocratic regimes, but especially on the post-Soviet space, including Belarus. And Lucan will give an overview of the rise of Lukashenko and the nature of his regime and some initial thoughts on how that relates to current events. Second, we have Maryia Rohava, research fellow at the University of Oslo. She will talk about also the features of Lukashenko's regime, how the regime has persisted, and what has shifted in Belarus that can explain current events. And her past work includes experience in civil society and civil rights advocacy at the Eastern European Studies Center in Lithuania, and she's also participated as an election observer in Belarus and Georgia and in Lithuania. And third, we have Olga Onuch, a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Manchester. Her first book, Mapping Mass Mobilization, which came out in 2014, explored some of the processes leading to mass protests in places like Ukraine and also Argentina. And she'll talk to us about the causes of the demonstration and sort of who is making up the demonstrators, the people in the protests. So I'll just hand over to Lucan. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Seva. I just wanted to add that this is Ed Schatz's first event as interim director, so congratulations to Ed. And also Olga, not only is she a storied academic, but she was here at the Munk School at CERES many years ago, and that's when I first met her. So it's a real pleasure to have her on board. So today I just want to talk about the nature of the Lukashenko regime, something I've studied quite a bit. And the first thing what's interesting about Lukashenko's regime is that it's amalgam of extreme authoritarianism, but with certain sort of surprising elements of openness. It is not a hybrid competitive authoritarian regime in the sense that I've talked about in my work. Elections are not competitive. There's massive vote fraud. Somehow in all elections, he's managed to get almost exactly 80%, which was what he got initially in his first election, 94, but since then it's been sort of manufactured. The legislature has been a rubber stamp. When I was interviewing opposition, actually someone tried to kill me, but that's a separate story, with a brick. But at the same time, there's a kind of element of openness. At least when I was there in the 2000s, people can speak against Lukashenko openly in cafes. But even more striking, real opposition has been allowed to run in elections. Not just sort of what they call in Russia kind of systemny opposition or fake opposition. You had Alexander Milinkevich in 2006. In 2010, you had Andrei Sannikov. And these are real dissidents. These are not sort of people bought off by the regime. And most recently, you have Tikhanovskaya. And by itself, this is quite remarkable. But even perhaps more remarkable, Tikhanovskaya was not just allowed to run. She was given 15 minutes on state television in which she gave an extraordinarily powerful speech denouncing Lukashenko and telling her own story. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's not many dictators, are sort of willing to give the opposition that kind of platform. So you ask, well, why is Lukashenko allowed? Why is he given the opposition this opportunity? Well, the main reason is that the opposition has historically been extraordinarily weak. Basically, there hasn't been any serious opposition challenge since the 1990s. In the 1990s, it was heavily associated with a kind of anti-Russian nationalism, which is very unpopular in Belarus. The Belarusian National Front basically thought they were in Ukraine or the Baltics. Turns out they were actually in a pretty Russophile country. And Andrew Wilson called the sort of opposition kind of almost a minority counterculture. So as a result, in the elections, there has been serious fraud, but until most recently, no one's doubted that Lukashenko would have actually won. Now, the most recent election, I think, is interesting, and there are many reasons for the sort of wave of protests and the crisis that Lukashenko is facing, which both the other speakers will talk about. But one of them is sheer stupidity on the part of Lukashenko. It was already evident in the run-up to the election that this was a different election, that sort of opposition, enthusiasm for opposition in the population was quite high. But initially, the opposition was faced with a real problem of a lack of unity. There were three major opposition candidates: Viktor Babarika, Valery Tsepkalo, and Sergei Tikhanovskaya's husband. But Lukashenko was very nice, and he resolved this problem by barring both Babarika and Tsepkalo from running, but allowing Tikhanovskaya's wife, Tikhanovskaya, to run. So that basically did the job of unifying the opposition. And then again, he gave her this remarkable opportunity to give this very powerful speech in opposition, which I think was watched on state television, for God's sakes. So why did he do that? Sheer misogyny. It's probably the only time misogyny has really helped democracy. I think we can sort of mark this down. I mean, he just does not take women seriously. In his mind, the men were the serious ones. The women, they were never going to be a threat. I'll just end with this. And what's interesting about this is that Lukashenko himself came to power as a result of a similar misjudgment on the part of the old Belarusian elite. So in the early 1990s, Lukashenko was a complete unknown. He was actually only known for one thing, which was writing an article in 1990 warning of the oncoming dictatorship in Belarus. But the political class, he was a member of parliament, they gave him the position to the head of the anti-corruption committee. And I asked people, why did you give this sort of total unknown head of the anti-corruption committee? Because I figured he was a country bumpkin and not part of the old nomenclatura, and therefore presented no real threat. So again, they sort of totally misjudged the situation, and Lukashenko took off with it. So I think what's interesting is that someone who himself came to power as a result of misjudgment hasn't himself engaged in sort of similar mistake. So I'll end with that and let the others talk.
Great, thank you so much, Lucan. Maryia, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Well, I think that I'd like to start with a kind of interesting observations that Belarus is a good example where a stable autocracy that holds a regular election can still surprise us. And even in 26 years, we consider Belarus as rather stable institutionally. We've seen little kind of innovations that the government has organized in maintain this kind of stable autocracy. But at the same time, the society has changed. And this is, I think, what kind of somebody reminded me recently, what it matters is as well to look at the people. And I think this is why I wanted to start how Belarusian people have changed. While maybe there is little kind of changes that we have seen on the institutional level of this autocracy, people did change, and we can observe it now with this protest. So first is this kind of, maybe we can start with the socio-demographic changes that happened in Belarusian society, is that, for example, according to 2019 census, we could see that this population is becoming much more urban. So we have at least 2 generations that have already resigned in the city. So they are actually urban citizens, which also has impacts on how they communicate and how they engaged in kind of civil and social life in this society. Another aspect is that they are much more, we can see much more interregional migration. So there is a significant disparity, economic disparity between different regions. So people much more inclined to leave their small cities and move into regional cities or a bigger center to the capital. In addition to it, there is also a completely new generation that hasn't experienced a significant political protest. They have observed, but basically the first kind of statistics that we receive now from the protest, that this is the first political protest they have engaged, they participated themselves. So they have probably no personal memories of political repressions that appeared in 2006 or 2010. So they are a bit remote from those kind of targeted political repressions that happened before. The second part is also on identities. This is my kind of topic that I was always kind of curious how identity played its role in Belarusian society. It's kind of key questions that attracted many researchers in Belarus. But I think what we have observed is that Belarusians do have their distinctive kind of sense of identity. They identify with the state, with a sovereign state, such as Belarus. At the same time, you can see as well they value a certain kind of ethnic identifiers. So they do respect the national language, they respect common culture, certain other ethnic aspects of Belarusian history. So there is this kind of stronger identification with the state, and we also can see that and I can see it in my research, and others have also observed that. So it's, in addition to this, there are people also interested in the kind of geopolitical orientation of Belarusian society. Right now, we can see that in their majorities, they support this multilateral kind of foreign policy, and there is no significant inclination towards any specific geopolitical preferences. They both respect the current or existing agreement with Russia. At the same time, they don't want to stop negotiations, for example, with other European countries. At the same time, also, I think another factor that kind of plays its role is kind of growing economic grievances that we can see here as well in this protest, that while this kind of relates to a long-term kind of problems in economic stagnation, and as well as the growing precariousness of state employees, because this kind of their previous kind of stable positions are right now compromised with much more temporal contracts, and they have to take unpaid leave. So this kind of presents certain precariousness in their political or in their economic situation. At the same time, the IT, for example, other sectors of the economies, they have grown. We have observed as well that the IT sector played its role in this specific protest. So it also kind of gives impetus for younger educated people to choose different employment and to move into different cities. This kind of leads me to another factor that played its role, I think, in this protest is the internet and its role. So the current internet penetration in Belarus is at 79%, which is significant. At the same time, for example, the mobile network coverage is really basically is almost covers everyone, and people do rely on their mobile phones in connecting to internet. And it's kind of played its role in changing the media landscape in Belarus, because with the growing mobile network and internet access, it was possible to produce different media content and compete with the state media in its influence. And this gave kind of possibilities for producing and developing political content locally based here that people can consume on their mobile phones, and can easily tune into a different narrative of politics, of culture, and in other aspects. This is kind of demographic aspect that I wanted to cover, but also I didn't want to stop at that, because at the institutional level, it's also kind of interesting, because basically, while this autocracy is stable, this autocratic election can be both produce the stabilizing and destabilizing effects. And I agree with Lucan that this autocracy really miscalculated the role of this election. So they were running on a certain agenda that didn't present interest to this new generation. So there is also kind of, we could consider some institutional weaknesses that this kind of personalist autocracy has, because there was still no succession strategy that it has presented. So there were hints of constitutional changes that we have observed if we could start observing them, they have started from 2014 and even earlier, but still there was nothing have been changed at their institutional level. There is also this autocracy has a limited recruitment strategy, so there is no kind of instrument of recruiting new people, new loyalists into the system, because there is no specific parties. There are also only organizations, but still this kind of system only functions on the loyalty-based principle. So, and I think this has kind of presented a lot of challenges, and since the system was not able to adjust and present a certain kind of recalibration for this new election, it really weakened it in this specific election. This is what I wanted to add, I guess.
Great, thank you so much, Maryia. And thank you everybody for keeping on time so far. That's always welcome. Last we have Olga, and she'll finish up by talking a bit about the qualities of the mobilization, the qualities of the protesters, or whatever else you'd like to talk about, I suppose. So please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. As Lucan said, it's always a treat to come back 10 years after you were a postdoc as an associate professor and get to engage with the people that really shaped your research. So I think some of the people on this panel I have to thank for some of the maybe comments. I was very much inspired by them and their work. So what are we witnessing now, right? I study mass mobilization. For those of you who do not know, I study it in Eastern Europe and Latin America. And it's very clear that once again, we see this sea of ordinary citizens spilling out onto the capital city in a country, right? And just to be clear, when I use the term ordinary citizens, I say they're ordinary citizens because normally they may or may not engage in politics. They may or may not vote, and they may or may not pay taxes. So they may or may not be also engaged with the state. And they tend not to be members of opposition groups or parties, actually. And they're typically not in the business of protest. And we have some data about that just to highlight what Maryia already said. And although there were other attempts that were highlighted already, like the Jeans Revolution in 2006, one which I tried to study back about 15 years ago, and it was decided that, well, 14 years ago, and it was decided by my supervisors at the time that perhaps Belarus won't be the place where we see a mass mobilization. Well, my goodness, were we ever incorrect about that? Why is this a moment of mass mobilization? Why is it important for us to understand it? It's because it's a moment when institutional politics fail and ordinary citizens then vote with their feet, as it might be, right? And in my view, the main tipping point that went from opposition, protest, and perhaps uncoordinated protest to a moment of mass mobilization was around Thursday, Friday, when we observed this cross-cleavage, cross-class coalition forming, specifically with the en masse joining of workers going on strike. That was a truly incredible moment to watch unfold. And of course, some of the initial defections, first low-ranking officers and former military personnel. Then we saw people like ambassadors and of course, the state television crew that went on strike. So by the time we come to Sunday the 16th, that's the flood, right? That's already after the mass mobilization cross-cleavage coalition was formed. And it's really like when an old ship hits an iceberg and finally we see all the iceberg that was below, in fact, right? So there's a lot of interesting things here that have been pointed out already by Lucan and Maryia, but I think the difference between going from an opposition protest moment to a moment of mass mobilization is really this mass tactical failure by Lukashenko. And this is this 7,000 arrests in less than 4 days. And I'm here quoting Danila Polishchuk, who is a former student, I think, of Lucan's and maybe Ed's as well, a journalist who said, essentially, this mass arrest amounted to putting a cross-section of society into some individual rooms. And this essentially meant that not only would these individuals start talking to each other, but their families would start gathering outside of the prisons, right? Their families would call throughout their networks. And you had people from different backgrounds united by one incident. And so this is a moment, mass mobilizations tend to happen when authoritarian leaders make mistakes, and I think some were already highlighted, but this particular miscalculation in the beginning, I think, was very important. But I'd like to say that now, 2.5 weeks into these protests, this is now an elite game. Protests must hold on and continue, but the parties in power and parties in opposition will now determine the outcome. So just how revolutionary this moment may or may not be in the future is still to be seen. And two things that I'd like to point out about how this moment of mass mobilization is different from previous moments of mass mobilization would be the geospatial nature, this regional diffusion that was much more widespread and happened much more quickly than we saw in places like Ukraine. And I think that's really important, that there's something new and interesting happening in Belarus that protest scholars will need to investigate. But now, 2.5 weeks in, what worries me most is that the defections have slowed. The state has started to use targeted tactics against different types of protesters. And in the Hirschmanian language, maybe we're seeing a little bit more exit than voice. Right? In times of crisis, you have this fight or flight option. And even seeing IT firms flee Belarus, I think is problematic. I think people are overestimating how important 6% of the GDP is to Lukashenko. And in fact, I think that this elite game is not shaping out in the way that maybe some people would like to see. So I'm going to give you some data about the protesters themselves. I am one of the principal investigators of a project, a really huge project called Mobilize. You can check us out at mobilizeproject.com. And we study the drivers of exit and voice, migration and protest in Poland, Morocco, Ukraine, Argentina, and now we added Belarus. So we've been running this online survey. It has loads of problems with the methodology, but we're doing our best to be scientifically rigorous since the 17th. And it's currently running as well. And we have over 1,200 responses right now. And about 800 of them are in the Belarusian language. The rest are in Russian. We also have availability of the survey in English. And the survey was collected by our German team. So please, please take everything I say with a huge grain of salt. But I do want to highlight some findings based on about 4,000 completed surveys, fully completed surveys as of yesterday midday. Our survey is biased to middle-aged women specifically, but that is a typical thing for online and Facebook-generated surveys, in case you're wondering. So in our survey, how many people protested? If we count those who say they protested online and on site in person, it's about 82% of our survey. Whereas if we only count those who protested in person, it's about 70%. So our sample is skewed to capture protesters, but that is indeed what we want to do in this survey. the majority participate in street marches. Over time, since we've been running this survey, we've seen that the people are telling us that they're participating in street marches, human chains, and demonstrations on squares more often. We've seen that street blockades, I stayed right about the same, only about 2% engage in kind of this form of direct action. But, and this is again, potentially a worrying element to report, where when in the first week of our survey, 20% of our respondents would say that they are engaging in strikes. This has fallen to about 3.6% of our respondents. And the actual nature of our respondents hasn't changed demographically. So that is, I think, an important point, and it does show that perhaps state tactics are working. When did they join? Most protesters say that they joined before the 11th of August, so that's 45% of the protesters, and another 45% after the 11th. And of course, we have the largest, we asked them about individual days of protest, and the largest numbers join in on the big weekend protests. We have also a clear indication that protesters are returners. 85% of those who say they protested in person have protested more than once, and predominantly in marches. Of those who said they protest, 50% are protesting on the big Sundays. Who do they protest with? And I said this last week to a different group. This is shocking. For those people who study protests, this is just amazing. We have about 60 to 65% of our protesters are telling us that the first time they joined a protest in Belarus in the last 2.5 weeks, they did so alone. And that should send shivers throughout everyone's bodies. This is an incredible statistic that is so rare. And about 40% say they went with family or friends, and another about 13% say they went with colleagues or neighbors or coworkers. What media sources they do? Well, we asked about what is the most trusted media source on the protest, what is the least trusted, what do you specifically use to get yourself informed about the protest, and what media sources would you use normally? Yes, they get their information from the internet. This shouldn't be a surprise. 90% get their information from the internet. But also 86% tell us, well, we saw people protesting, so we knew where to go and what to do. We also asked them, what did you do when the internet was turned off? And Maryia was just saying that this is an ongoing problem. Well, 63% of the protesters say that when the internet is disconnected, they rely on word of mouth and communication with their friends, family, and other people. And we have individual statistics if you want to know about what type of word of mouth and direct contact is most important. The most trusted, Telegram is most trusted, as are a few others, and state television is the least trusted. None of these things should be surprising. But we should note that this is not just simply maybe a Telegram, as some people have said, revolution, because protesters rely equally on Viber, Facebook, and Telegram, and then very close behind are YouTube and Instagram for information about protests. So they don't really rely on Twitter and WhatsApp when it comes to social media. Why did they protest? Well, we've had some changes with our changing protest cohort in our survey. Last week when we asked this, the official election result being fraudulent was in 5th place as a reason why people protest, but now it's firmly in 2nd place. But the #1 reason why people say they were motivated to protest was the government's mass arrests and detentions of the first protesters, right? And this just underscores that was the main motivating element. And I should note that 4th, before defending democracy even, is to secure a better economic future, just to underline what was already said. So this is certainly in the minds of the protesters. Also very high up, 82% think that Lukashenko mismanaged the COVID pandemic. And certainly not something we hear in any speeches or on many signs, but it is in the back of the minds of the protesters. I think one of the last things I want to tell you about is, what do they want from the protest? What do the protesters expect to happen now? Well, I can tell you that they know what they want. They are decided. Less than 0.1% thought it was hard to say what they want to see happen next, okay? And I'll tell you what it's not about. they don't think this is going to, they don't hope to see actually that living standards will improve and that poverty and inequality will improve. They do not particularly hope that there will be new political parties that will better represent their interest. And this is not an anti-elite, anti-corruption sort of protest, right? We're talking about only 2 or 1% of individuals surveyed want to see any of those things happen. They also do not really care for foreign policy direction type outcomes. So they do not, only 1% want to see closer ties with the EU, and only 1% want to see good relations with Russia. What do they want? Well, there's a almost nearly perfect 3-way split. Top of it is they want Lukashenko to step down one way or another. Second is it's not just about the elections and the leader. They want to see changes in Belarus that would lead it to a full, complete, normal democracy. And finally, the third is free and fair elections to be held, and for those next free and fair elections to determine the winner. As you can see, there's a variation. One is Lukashenko must leave at all cost. One is we want to see a democratic future more broadly. And this final one, free and fair elections, should Lukashenko win them, we would be okay with it. And I think it's really important to just report back to you very quickly, how do protesters describe the protests or would like to perhaps name the protests in their own words, right? We gave them some options of what we think the protests are called. They disagreed with most of them, but they gave us hundreds of suggestions of what they would like us to call the protests. And some of them is, first one is the Belarusian evolution, the white revolution. Another theme is on fighting for rights that should be, fighting for truth, fighting for justice, fighting against lies, or fighting against Lukashenko's terror. Women. We have dozens, if not more, suggestions that this should be called the women's revolution or the women's evolution. Freedom is another big theme of suggestions. Freedom and independence, march for freedom, march against violence and freedom, freedom of Belarus, peace, peaceful actions, peaceful rallies, peaceful protests. This is not a revolution. Theme around dictator, and I think my favorite name for a mass protest is ripping the blue fingers from the chair revolution. And dignity, as we saw in Ukraine, several respondents think that this is a revolution of dignity, a revolution of honor and dignity. And finally, the flower revolution or the flower evolution. Now, please note that in the few hundred responses that we received from protesters, not one has said that this should be called a telegram revolution. So let's not do that ourselves. And let's respectfully use the language that protesters use themselves. And here a shout out to Tanya Lakot and Alexander Harasimenko, who have been arguing this point all over the place as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Olga. Well, we have a number of questions, and why don't we get to them right away. First of all, this is a question for all of the panelists. Why did Lukashenko miscalculate so badly? I mean, partly, yes, misogyny allowing the candidates to run, but why claim 80%? He knew that would anger people. Why mishandle relations with Russia the way he did? Is it just that he's totally lost in this cocoon, or is the information not getting to him? Can we even speculate about the motives of such a person? I wonder what you all think.
If I may, I think, of course, we're simply guessing. I think one of the reasons is that he sort of backed himself into a corner in terms of the 80%. And so, and my guess is that part of the reason why he had this very high figure is, one, he's basically had the same result a few percentage points either way in every single election. So, for example, if he came out with a more sort of reasonable number, like 55, that would already kind of be a signal to weakness. And so one might guess that. And in any case, the whole notion of election in Belarus was never about counting the votes. It's always about showing dominance. And I mean, that's true in Latin America. I mean, the idea that you sort of have numbers that were believable suggest, it's a completely different mindset. And so it's really about just showing total dominance. And so I think that's the reason. In terms of relations with Russia, they've always been bad. Ever since the beginning. I mean, he came to power on a pro-Russian platform, but he's always resisted. He's always been fighting with Russian leaders, and Putin has been desperate in various ways to get rid of him, giving money to various opposition forces. And it's another interesting thing about Russia. It's in the Belarusian context is that when I went there and I was talking to opposition, I mean, there's such a contrast with Ukraine. Russia was a source of hope, right? They sort of saw Russia as a kind of way to sort of oust the regime. So I mean, it has to be pretty bad when Russia is your source of democratic hope.
Would Olga or Maryia like to add?
Yeah, sure. I think it's also part of it. I think the entire system is based, as we could see, is on this proving popularity, basically. So a personalist kind of regime that is visualized in just one specific leader has to reproduce popularity in a certain way. And since there is a very limited avenue for that, elections were continuously used for proving this popularity. I think the only kind of interesting part of why is 80% exactly were so perceived so fraudulently is demystifying the entire popularity myth in this election. It has started even prior to the election kind of day. And I think I already made this point somewhere before, but basically starting from April, there was this kind of interesting demystification games. There were new reports about, the significant drop in the popularity for not just for him, but for the presidential office. So it provided the venue for media platforms, independent media platforms, to conduct a survey. And this started a famous meme that kind of continues right now. But basically, it just helped to unpack this complex popularities that has persisted in previous years. And I think it was as well, it forced kind of new surveys and some data that have existed to compete with each other. Basically, there was some independent data showing the significant drop in the popularity of the president and the presidential office, or trust, basically, it's better to be defined. And then it kind of forced the government to fake, or not to fake, but basically produce some data just to confirm, no, that the popularity still has persisted. And I think it's kind of certain end, it was just proving that they can do whatever in this specific system. So I think it was part of that. And also, I think the miscalculation of the grievances that exist in the society. I think when you stop for other independent surveys where you cannot conduct and check other, for example, state surveys against independent surveys, it became a certain information bubble in which you function. So we're still not sure what kind of information and in what form the presidential office receives this information. But basically, I think there is certain kind of miscalculation of the entire kind of social mood prior to the election. That's kind of my take on it.
Great, thank you. Olga, did you want to add, or should we move to the next question?
I think we can move. Yeah, I think that was a great answer.
Okay, great. Well, we have a question from Milan Cherny, who's an MPhil student in Russian and East European Studies at Oxford. He wants to know, it seems to me that one of the key factors that can determine evolution in the following days and weeks is the defection of the security services, he says. Some police members have shown signs of support toward the protesters, but more elite forces seem to have stuck by Lukashenko. What, in your opinion, is the main reason for why elite forces continue to support the regime despite grim economic prospects, despite lack of popular support for Lukashenko? And where do you see that process of defection or co-optation going in the near future? And I suppose this is a question to any three of you.
So I think that's, of course, the million-dollar question, and that's if the BKGB, as it's called, and KGB, they retain the name, goes, so goes Lukashenko. My experience when I was there, is that one of the interesting things about the KGB is that it's actually quite autonomous from Lukashenko, or at least it was in the 2000s. I actually was shocked. I actually was able to interview various KGB agents in Minsk, and we sat in an open cafe, and they just trashed Lukashenko right and left. You could tell they had a complete sense of safety, and so it may be different now. It was a while ago, But so one possibility is that sort of traditionally the KGB has been closely tied to Russia, and this may be sort of a question of Russia's this is where Russia might have enormous impact behind the scenes. So when Putin says pull the plug, then that'll be it. But I think that's an important question.
Olga or Maryia?
Maybe I could just add, I think I would add on a defection, part of the defection. I think right now what we observe is this kind of what Olga already mentioned, is that there is a defection has stopped at certain level. So we see low level defection, but it kind of is very stagnated and it's not really going further than that. And I think the problem right now is that they really raise the stakes. So the cost of defection is really high at this moment, because even for the low level defections, like local prosecutor, they even tracked him to Russia, and now he has returned back to Belarus. So, and I think this kind of other element to it, because last week they also honored them. So they created a special list of honoring people who participated in this. It also kind of created additional level of cost. So now knowing the names, it's very difficult and costly personally for you to defect. And I think they are really playing on just raising the cost of defection.
Yeah, I would think absolutely both of those points are very correct. Typically, the type of security forces that you are speaking about and the types of armed forces, they're often the last to go. So it's not surprising that they haven't gone yet, and they do tend to be the last to go. I've written about this both in my book about the protests in Argentina and Ukraine in 2004, but also about the Euromaidan and other places, about the different types of calculi that the different elements within the party in power make. And I think that's very correct, Maryia, as you point out, that the stakes for this particular group to defect were not only higher than others from the very beginning, but now have, I think, been raised a little bit as well. And I think what worries me here is in a lot of these other cases where the military does move to the side of the protesters, or the security forces move to the side of the protesters, or riot police, or whatever these elements, it's usually when the elite parties in opposition have interlocutors or direct access to them, right? And they, through informal channels, through backdoor channels, that's when they start talking about things, exchanging information. There's usually an information gain that happens between them, and the opposition gains some knowledge from inside the regime. That's happening much less from my conversations with people right now. And that, again, would be a sign that these defections might not be happening anytime soon. But we can always be surprised. That wouldn't be the first time, certainly.
All right, great, thank you. Well, Lucan had to go. He had to pick up his kid. And we will be wrapping up in about 10 or 15 minutes. So let me just throw out 2 or 3 questions that we've received in the meantime, and see if our 2 remaining panelists would like to answer 1 or 2, or perhaps all of them. One question from Michael Campbell-Thompson. There are about 1.5 million Belarusians living abroad. How have they been active in these protests besides showing or demonstrating their support? Perhaps one difference here with the Ukrainian diaspora, which was extremely active a few years ago. Josh Gold asks, could any of the panelists speak to the widespread internet shutdowns that followed the election? Another question by Thomas Bruce, who's a PhD student here, an IR question, so I'll land on that one because I'm biased. Given the geopolitical situation, which some of you mentioned, given the weakening of US linkages in the area, how should we think about the leverage that places like the EU, places like the US have with Belarus, and the impact it has, not just on regime transitions in Belarus, but going forward in the region over the next perhaps 5 or 10 years. So I'll stop there.
So I think some of those better answered by Maryia, and some of those maybe I'll give Joyce. So we are studying the diaspora as well simultaneously. Our survey is running around the world, and one of the main interests is what are the differences. And I think it's very interesting that people are constantly comparing Belarus to Ukraine. I don't know if that's always the way to go, but certainly from our knowledge of the Belarusian diaspora abroad, it wasn't as well organized. It doesn't mean that they weren't organized, but it wasn't as well organized as the Ukrainians were, right? But they have organized very quickly and really impressively, in a truly impressive fashion over the last 2.5 weeks. So their institutions that existed have grown, membership has grown, individual protests all across certainly North America and Western Europe, but also in other corners of the globe. So I think that is something to be really taken aback by. And there is a disconnect about what the diaspora thinks the protests are about and what protesters from inside Belarus are telling us. And that I think will be interesting to dive deeper in. Internet, I think I'll let you say something about that, Maryia. But Western leverage, I think it's very tricky for the EU to have much leverage in Belarus for many reasons. And I'm sure other IR scholars would be better at highlighting that point. And for many reasons, that this is unlikely to be a main factor, but Western support of the opposition, Western support of the protesters will be vital, and specifically supporting that opposition in any negotiations or this information game that has proven to be crucial in past protest events, both in the region and elsewhere in the world. I'll leave it there.
I'll jump in on the question of the internet shortages being like experiencing personally. I think so. I started with the kind of the timelines. The main kind of internet shortages started on the election day. It mainly was linked that basically all social networks, including YouTube or Facebook, were just inaccessible on the election day. So it was also mainly kind of targeting the online platforms that was collecting online the photographs of the ballots. So people did sign up. 1.3 million signed up for this platform to submit their ballots. So it was mainly directed to stop that kind of process on the election day. So, and we can see that it's kind of started to spread. So the government first claimed that there was a lot of DOS attacks from abroad, but basically we could see as well from the reports from Internet Block, I think, they presented that they were basically creating filtering that was almost equivalent to the type of filtering we observe in China. So it was targeting specific keywords. So certain websites were accessible, but at the same time, after some time, they were not accessible. So it was really filtering a lot of content on the internet. That provided a lot of opportunity for people to promote different access. So Telegram channels that were still available, they provided a lot of possibilities for people to download VPNs. So there was even like different mirrors for VPNs to be created. So there were people as well exchanging even USB sticks with VPNs. So there was a lot of self-organization in trying to avoid internet blockage. But at the same time, I mean, was mainly directed at internet savvy, maybe educated to maybe younger bit generation, but I think still several half of the probably population ended up in complete internet blockage for several days. So many didn't even see what was going on, and the video content was started loading basically on the third day. So when what basically Olga said, that when the main kind of start of mobilization has happened, it was the first kind of access to videos and photos of all the evidence of what was happening on the ground. So right now, just last week, we also received the Ministry of Information decision on blocking 73 websites that also filtered a lot of independent media, and also the access to a number of popular VPN services used during this time. But then again, it's we have seen some blocking or internet blocking on certain websites, but not as massive as we have seen right now. We observe right now.
Let's just jump in, because I think we all focus on in the internet age, coming to you via Zoom, right? We all focus on the internet so much, but it's just yet another tool for communication in the mobilization process. It is important, it speeds up the process of mobilization and passing on of information, but it is not the only tool that protesters or activists around the world use. And this is also not the only context where protests actually swell when the internet is still not locked in back. So in Egypt, the same thing happened. You actually get a rise of protest engagement when there is a shutdown of the internet. In Ukraine, if you were actively engaging in protests on the Maidan, you had very little access because of the congestion of mobile phone users, and internet would constantly drop, even though the government didn't necessarily cut the internet. So I think it's important to underscore that those early mobilizations that were happening in that first week in Belarus, a lot of word of mouth was taking place. And you know, you can see something on the internet, you can see an image, and you might wonder to yourself, is it real, is it not real? But if your friend, your family member tells you something, you're much more likely to believe it. And if it's horrific and it's somebody you know or distantly know, then that will motivate you to join a protest much more so than even an image could. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have a number of other questions, and if we can't finish by 4, I think Ed will just take over, given that the number of people are interested, and we promise we won't keep you too long after 4, but we do have several other questions. Alexander Schwartz asks, okay, so what will it take for Lukashenko to resign, if anything? Should the EU, you both have mentioned about what can or cannot the EU do. Should the EU intervene more in some ways through sanctions or something like that? Or is there other ways to support the mass protesters? And beyond that, what could be done to nudge Lukashenko to agree to some kind of inclusive dialogue with civil society, with the coordination council, et cetera, et cetera? Is this something that only Putin could do if he puts enough pressure on Lukashenko, or are there other venues that you could see might be possible?
Maybe I could start this time. I think it's all kind of questions that we are currently interested, because we are in this moment where there is just no moving point from the regime, and of course the events today even show that there will be further reliance on repressions, and the government obviously feels confident that it can still rely on repressions and targeted as well persecution against coordination council, against certain activists, against labor collectives that are organizing a strike, which were quite important in this mobilization and cross-sectional mobilization. So I think what we still don't see is this kind of complete weakening of the regime when it's ready for the dialogue. And that really, I agree with other Belarusian political analysts that we still have to take apart some kind of weakening, something that weakens the political regime, and this is only could come from defection. So this is actually, in my perspective, this is providing, or rather, how to say, minimizing costs of defection for the elites, I would say. So somehow providing them possibilities or guarantees of no persecution. I guess something those kind of guarantees could provide, or at least limit their exposure and motivate maybe for defection. But at this moment, considering the structure of the regime, which is based on very limited circle of the elites and on and which is based also on the security services, it's really hard to say. It's really hard to see if the regime is actually weakened or just recalibrating and is ready to use more repressions at this moment.
Great, thanks so much. Before Olga answers, I do have to run, but we still have over 100 people listening in, and I'm sure they would love to know what you have to say, and I would love to know as well, but my time is up. But thank you, both of you, for joining, and thanks, Ed, for setting it up. I will run and leave it to the rest of you.
Great, thanks. Olga, did you want to continue on this question?
I think this is, some of the multi-billion-dollar questions that are being asked here. And if we only had some all I can do when I look at these questions is look at the 20 or so protest movements I have been engaged in studying and what happened elsewhere and what could possibly happen here, right? Based on past patterns. And when it comes to the person in power, the party in power, they're making their own calculus, right? And there's different calculi that they can make. One is, I want to remain a statesman no matter what, right? Seeing the Swan Lake being played, whether it's on the television set or elsewhere, and knowing that your time is up, that requires a leader that is really capable of seeing this and then reacting to it. Kuchma in Ukraine was one such leader. He started communicating through interlocutors to the Yushchenko camp, right? And then negotiating his way out of that situation, right? It was easier for him because he wasn't the candidate trying to gain power, but nonetheless, right? In another, you know, we can go through Egypt, we can go through Venezuela. I mean, talk about just deciding I'm going to fight this out no matter what, right? In Ukraine in 2014, Yanukovych also was constantly misjudging, constantly miscalculating. He was never a weak character as the way that you're describing, because the number of defections weren't as massive. Potentially he could have held on a little bit longer, who knows? But I think this, whether or not a leader will decide to engage in a dialogue or negotiations with the opposition, is really about the leader themselves and the type of leader that they are at that moment, the type of leader that they see themselves in the future. If they don't see an option for themselves to be a statesman in the future, then they're going to hold on. I mean, other examples, be it in Syria or elsewhere, right, where holding on with the last final grip to whatever you can. The problem with that is that if they do lose, or even if they do not win, they're not holding on to the same version of what they had before. So Syria can never go back to the Syria before, obviously, all the events took place. Venezuela can never go back to before 2014. And so they are rulers of failed states. And that could be maybe a lesson for Lukashenko if he doesn't want to be like these two individuals. He has a chance to be more like Kuchma. I never thought I'd paint Kuchma in a positive light, but there it is, right?
We're in strange times, aren't we, Olga?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So let me actually sort of follow up on that, and we'll maybe do another round, perhaps two, and then wrap it up. Just a little bit more on the possible end game that one can imagine, because sure, just following on Olga's depiction, it's the calculus that's in the man's head that really determines so much of what happens going forward, especially in the moment of a stalemate, right? And yet, I guess I wonder, just let me ask an open-ended question on that. What kinds of things might begin to shift his calculus? Defections, sure, okay, so we know that. But again, that seems to have tapered off from your description. So what other kinds of things? Here, is there a role for the international community in shifting his calculus? And we tend to think of it as, you know, well, what can the West do? In Canada, we ask, what can Canada do? These are relevant questions, but maybe there's a concerted approach that might orchestrate something of an exit for this person who, even if he hangs on by a thread, he'll simply be hanging on by a thread, and you can't imagine good governance coming in the wake of this. That would be bad for everybody, whether you're east or to the west of Belarus. So in other words, is there a role for the international community in nudging the calculus of Lukashenko? And then maybe a little bit more to Maryia. This is spurred by a question from Emma Sabzalieva in the chat, or in the Q&A. If we're at a stalemate, and if this is more or less an elite game right now, what role do ordinary people play in nudging the calculus, or is the role for ordinary people essentially done here? It strikes me that it's probably not, but I guess I'd like to, along with Emma, I'd like to hear what you think the role for ordinary people might be going forward.
Shall I maybe start? Because I think it's always a better kind of way of not dismissing as well the role of people, because I think that's my kind of main interest in Belarus was always because I always thought that there was a kind of a much more interesting story in people's perceptions and loyalties in authoritarian regimes, because even when they comply, it doesn't mean this compliance will persist for eternity. Basically, there is also limits of this compliance, and I think we have seen that it has limits even with this kind of airtight election commissions that were pre-selected and they were kind of organized by loyalists, but kind of more low-level loyalists, but at the same time still loyalists, and they showed defection, and they showed this kind of resistance not to comply with the order, basically, and that was super surprising for me, because I haven't expected that people would record this kind of such a blunt situation that was happening in the election commission, and people coming forward was really kind of an interesting test to the system, I would say. And I really think that the kind of key question here as well was the strike action that was happening on the ground that we have seen last week. And now, since they're so pursuing the activists in the strike action, I think the supporting different support that could come in the strike action is kind of key. Possibilities for still staging strikes, and possibilities for people who maybe organize strike action to have as well certain maybe guarantees. So even if they are dismissed from work, they can be compensated and so on. So this is done as well at the domestic level. People do fundraise quite a lot of money for the strike committee actions. And we still have to see whether it will persist, because if now they will be targeting this mass mobilization that is happening spontaneously, probably it might still come to the workers and their kind of possibilities to endorse people in this moment. But again, it's really hard to predict. I can see right now that there is a lot of targeted repression. So people who are the most active activists, they will be receiving days in prison or significant fines, or they will be asked to leave the country, as it was happening in some on some state factories. So we really have to see how it unfolds. But I still have I believe that what is happening on the ground really matters, because it signals other people the option to join. And I think that even the possibility that it has persisted for several weeks now, last Sunday was a really significant event, that if it's still happening, if people are still willing to come in the street, and even kind of social anthropological data of people collecting during this mass events indicate that people are still willing to continue no matter what the cost, is really important in this moment. So persisting with this signaling that they are against the government is an important encouragement, both for workers and maybe other defectors at the low level.
Yeah, absolutely, Maryia. I agree with you. I mean, I'm fascinated by, I live for studying why ordinary citizens do these things. So I think people power is a real thing. And certainly that, I think, is part of the calculus, right? It's not, the protests need to keep going, and that might affect Lukashenko's calculus particularly, and has seemed to affect other leaders. But we know that they haven't been enough, right, in a lot of cases. And so when it comes to defections, I think we need to be a little bit more clear that there are different types of possible defections. So they can be in the armed forces, right, that we've listed, but they can also be amongst the political economic elite, and they may be public or they may be private. Sometimes private defections that we don't know about can be more influential in changing for a leader to change their course during one of these events. We find that out obviously through various qualitative and archival evidence in the aftermath, but that has been proven to be the case. And then there's also the defections of his own constituents, the people who are supportive of him nonetheless, right? So if more of those individuals leave or take away their support. And of course, the workers, and they've been trying to manage worker defections, particularly because the image of the worker and how important the Belarusian worker is for Lukashenko is quite clear. And then you have the elements, the economic elements. There are a variety of ways that within Belarus, but also external actors can try to alter Lukashenko's calculus by economic means, right? And specifically means that would, so we shouldn't, for instance, the IT sector, Lukashenko doesn't see as particularly close to him, right? These are not his supporters, but industry workers, specifically the famous tractor makers, so on, those are his constituents. Now, if somehow that industry is affected economically, that is a risk for him. That might push him to calculate differently. And the international actors, of course, they can support, and this does often affect the calculus, they can support the opposition, though that's more important in my perspective. Moral support, it can be financial support, technical support of a variety of kinds, but also providing assurance for a way out and protection should things really go south, right? And that's what international actors have been doing in past events. Now, international actors have gotten it really majorly wrong in the past, and I'm thinking of one particular East European politician that threatened the coordinating committee in Ukraine in 2014, essentially said, they will kill you all tomorrow if you don't sign this negotiation pact, blah, blah, blah. That individual couldn't have been more wrong about the defections already happening and was pushing the opposition actors to an agreement that really wasn't in their favor, right? So that also can happen. And I think the international actors that are involved need to be a little bit more humble than they were certainly in 2014. I think we all know who we're talking about. And the use of force here, the calculus to use more force. Now, one thing is a leader might have the stomach. Some people have the stomach to use force, some people don't, right? And that changes their calculus of what they're going to do. The next thing is the availability, right? And that's whether or not there are defections. But also external support to use force, which we know has been a key factor and potentially is in that if Russia does support by bringing external forces in, for instance, right, all those things would affect the calculus that Lukashenko makes. I think he's working on reshaping the storyline. The targeted attacks against certain types of opposition individuals rather than all the people, learning from that 7,000 people arrested mistake thing, right? And the opposition, the international community can't say Lukashenko is against the Belarusian people. No, he's against those troublemakers individually, right? That reframing of the conversation is pretty impressive. This authoritarian learning that's happening as we watch it is impressive.
No, that's great. Oh, Maryia wants to add something. Go ahead.
I also think it's also with some technological support, as we now know. So obviously, authoritarian learning with some helpful hand of a very keen neighbor. But I think it's also like this kind of reshaping narrative. What it might do as well is it creates it's kind of targeted at creating certain kind of division lines, and they are trying to purposefully to maintain this narrative that is also picked up not just at the domestic but also at the international level. I think this kind of reframing of the traditional oppositions that I have observed even from European politicians is just troublesome, saying that this traditionally EU-funded opposition is a troublemaker. It was already kind of a key line that have been repeated by some EU parliamentary members. So all of this could potentially kind of helps for them to create a lot of noise in this movement. So it's now becomes not a pro-democracy, it becomes a lot of different narratives that they can pick up and play with it. And this is definitely as well kind of pollutes a bit how different players can engage, because they also pick up on these noises, and obviously some narrative are really persistent, and then they pick up on those. And this is why I feel very kind of how problematic it is actually to create a balance policy right now, because sanctions, and it really has to be very targeted sanctions. And again, it's really unclear how it actually help the pro-democracy movement, or whether it actually will elevate and help to create a very coherent authoritarian system. So all of this really requires time and effort, and then this is what they don't really have at this moment. And since the expertise in Belarus had, I would say, was stagnating at certain moments, so there were kind of interest, but then in recent kind of years, the interest has diminished. So I'm not sure as well what kind of expertise as well as is used in creating this policy. And yeah, basically that's what kind of my concerns are at the expert level, and as well that a targeted policy requires time and effort, basically. So how can we do that in this limited period is unclear.
This is all unfolding in real time and on multiple dimensions and multiple scales. I mean, it strikes me, before I turn it back to the panelists for just a final word on anything that they want to return to just very briefly, it strikes me that as the regime tries to shift the narrative, right, the ways you both have described, but also describing, NATO's malicious intention to invade Belarus and that kind of narrative, which 2 months ago would have been a bizarre narrative to come from this kind of regime, given how Lukashenko was talking at that point. But leave it to an authoritarian leader to shift on a dime. The question is whether that narrative gains any kind of traction, or among whom it gains traction, especially when it comes up against the very hard to ignore reality of these people who've been actually, from all walks of life, as you both have described, who've actually found themselves incarcerated, right? So the regime can say what it wants to, but if my cousin spent 3 days in the CISO in the KGB, that's a very lived experience that's hard to reframe in any kind of way. So I feel like that's one of the tensions kind of going forward to think about. Let me just mention a couple other tensions that I'm kind of hearing. We probably won't be able to tackle in your last comments, but I'll just sort of float them. One of the things we didn't talk about is this sort of, I guess, the sort of acephalous character of this movement, right? There's Tikhanovskaya, which maybe she's, of course she was the opposition figure allowed to run, but she never, correct me if I'm wrong, she never really was able to consolidate the opposition. And so you have this movement, which is in all of its glory, it's spontaneous, it's bottom up and all that kind of stuff, but that makes it hard to engineer some kind of an end game, right? And whether they can crystallize support around a single figure or a couple of figures will be, of course, crucial to and it sounds like from the beginning of our discussion, that's actually been the Achilles heel of the opposition for years. So that'll be one other thing to think about going forward. Final thing I'll mention, and just because you kind of alluded to it here and there, but we didn't talk about it centrally, is the role of women in this, the particular role that women have played. And I'm just reading the press, and so I hardly an expert on this, but it's pretty unusual to see this quite visible role of women. And given what we know about Lukashenko's instinctual attitude towards women, just watching him get out of that helicopter with the gun that had no magazine and marching along, showing all of his, showing what a man he was. Clearly this is somebody who maybe that's what gives women particular sort of, moral standing in this bottom up sort of movement. But that'll be an interesting thing to see sort of how that plays out going forward. Before I turn it over for last little bits, maybe 1 minute from each of you, somebody asks if this will be available to listen to later. We do plan to. This is our first event. We're recording it, and we plan to make it available So barring any technical difficulties, it should be available just for the person who asked in the chat. So last words to each of you. Who wants to start? Maryia.
Actually, we'll pick up on the issue of women, I think, because I really, I was personally, I think, inspired by the role of women in this campaign, and it definitely provided a lot of public platform of discussing as well about the role of women in politics in general, not just in Belarus, but in Eastern Europe, basically as well, having Poland, the neighbor, having additional as well problems with the rights of women and LGBTQ. So it's kind of indicates that it's, yeah, the role of women really played a significant, I think, mobilization role. And I actually link it to what we have observed in other countries with, I think, the mobilization effort in such extent also happened in response to such a sexualized and violence that we were able to observe with this trauma of visible violence that came with us, with images, with, you know, a lot of visual contents that traumatized people in a kind of very individual, personal level, and it was targeted specifically at men. There were more men arrested in that moment during the mobilization efforts. They were targeting mostly young men, and they were arresting more men, as well as they brutally abusing men. So I think the response from women was in response to the specific violence. And this is why they could lead such a kind of mobilization moment of peaceful protest in the next days that unfolded. And I think this kind of indicates as well that what kind of role women actually could play in mobilization, because when women get involved in this autocratic resistance, most of the time protests are becoming much more peaceful. They rely much more on peaceful efforts and peaceful actions, and they are basically the state, the autocratic state that is kind of visualized in this aging male autocrat is much more reluctant to use violence against women and children that are participating in those mass events. And I think this is kind of limits there as well possibilities of using violence. So the promoting active role of women is key at this moment. I think that their participation is also quite important in maintaining peacefulness of the protest at this moment.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Maryia just said. And I think, Ed, you're very right to point out that this opposition is not actually cohesive, coordinated, all those things we'd like to see in opposition in this moment. That's not what's happening, right? And we know this from our data that only about 4% of people get any information from opposition organizations or political parties, even through third channels. So that also tells us the connectivity to the ordinary citizen that's protesting of these opposition agrupations is limited, which is worrying. And I think that is an issue. And when it comes to the women, I'm not a fan of saying that when women protest, protests will be peaceful, because I think we've seen women do, I mean, Ukraine, we had the Molotov princess who actually helped perfect the Molotov. And I think her name's also Maryia, I don't know if you know. So she would personally consider that an affront to her. But it is the case that the types of direct actions that women are involved in, not just in Belarus, as we've seen unfold, but in other places, are these more peaceful. And the using of this toxic masculinity and misogyny that Lucan started us off with in the beginning of our seminar, using that against the regime, right? Because the regime's legitimacy to use violence ends at hitting, brutally beating whatever mothers, young women, beautiful young women holding flowers. And that certainly has been used in the past. In Egypt, mothers started coming out when things started to turn more violent and kissing the different army men. Same thing in Ukraine, and many protest activists in 2004 and 2014 would push specifically young women to the front that were beautifully, the makeup and the hair was done specifically to intimidate the police, because a police man, woman, person is still less likely to perpetrate violence against these types of citizens. But that changes at some point. Whether it's Assad, whether it's Chavez, whether it's Yanukovych, those regimes also decided to perpetrate violence against female protesters, irrespective. So I think that is a useful thing, for a useful element for a while. But I would be a fan of calling this the women's evolution of Belarus, or the flower women's evolution of Belarus. I think there's really nice suggestions there from our protesters. So I'm on that side of the spectrum too, Maryia.
Great. It's such a rich discussion as one can expect from something that's ongoing and that's multifaceted and complex, and where information is, there's a lot of information, but of course no one is in command of absolutely everything all the time. There's much more to discuss, so I guess we'll have to do this again, hopefully once things have ended in a peaceful and successful way, whatever that may look like. We're in a troubling moment, but we hope that this ends, of course, in the best kind of way. I wanted to thank, on behalf of CERES and the Monk School and the Eurasia Initiative, Olga, Onuch, and Maryia Rohava, as well as Lucan who left us, and Seva, Gunitsky. It's been a great discussion, and I look forward to seeing some of you the next time that we do a Eurasia Initiative event, which should be, I think, September the 18th. But stay tuned for the announcements. Thanks again, Olga and Maryia.
Thank you.